Hello, and welcome to the DC Bar Pro Bono Center's webinar, Cooperative Models for Building Back Better. I'm Christine Kulamani, staff attorney with the DC Bar Pro Bono Center's nonprofit and small business legal assistance programs. Before we begin, some thank yous. First, thank you to my colleague, Lauren Paley, who has made sure that everything behind the scenes that needed to happen happened to make today's webinar possible. Also, a tremendous thank you to our presenter, Lyfoung, an inclusive economies attorney based here in DC, for joining us today and sharing this information. Some logistics for today's webinar. For those of you joining us live, the webinar will be recorded. You can send it to your friends, you can watch it again. In addition, you have immediate access to the slides in your GoToWebinar control panel on your screen. If you have questions as we go, please send them to us through the questions box in your control panel. We'll get to as many as we can at the end of the presentation. So now on to cooperatives. Many of us have heard of them before. Frequently, we think of housing, farming, but what cooperatives are, where they came from, and how they differ from traditional ownership models for businesses is a mystery to many, as are the benefits of cooperatives, especially worker cooperatives. Worker cooperatives and similar worker-owned models empower workers, enable them to obtain economic stability, and allow them to build wealth. At this particular time, as communities, business owners, and individuals look to regain an economic foothold in their community, cooperatives are able to play an increasingly important role. And what that role is, we'll jump into today. And with that, I will hand it over to you, Pacyinz. Thanks.
Thank you, Christine. I too will start by giving my thanks definitely to Christine, who said yes when I proposed let's do a cooperative models for building back better workshop. I also thank Lauren, of course, for helping with the technical assistance. And I thank all of you who are taking your time during the noon hour to come and learn more about this topic. All right, and we were just, okay, great. So the agenda today, we're going to be looking a little bit at the Building Back Better context. We will also look at an overview of cooperative models, how to form cooperatives in DC. We will briefly touch upon worker cooperatives as well, and what are not actual worker cooperative models, but they're similar employee ownership, I guess, approaches. And I hope that we will have a discussion where we might also be able to discuss next steps. So the goal is hopefully present in about 40 minutes and then have 15 minutes of discussion. So as the time is so short, we will not be able to cover everything, but hopefully we'll be able to get a good basis. So building back better, the context, this is definitely part of the post-pandemic recovery and having aspirations that as we are rebuilding after the pandemic, we might rebuild something better than what used to be there before, which, as we saw, caused a lot of challenges and heartaches actually during the pandemic. So here I was just going to share a little bit of course, what happened during the pandemic, the fact that, you know, and from maybe, I guess, a more personal lens. So for example, my sister, who is a computer professional, started raising chickens in her backyard because she was concerned that even though, you know, people might have money, you might not even get food because of the supply chain. There were a lot of people joking about the fact that we have to learn what leaves to use instead of toilet paper, because once again, there was no assurance that there would be toilet paper. We saw a lot of images of farmers destroying their products, because once again, there were issues with maybe the types of contracts that they had or transportation problems. And so even though food was available, they may not be able to be distributed. It might not be able to be distributed. And then we saw also a lot of spontaneous mutual aid efforts taking place, just because overnight a lot of people were out of work and had no resources. And then in the health sector, we saw hospitals postponing health procedures and healthcare because they had to prioritize the pandemic. And as a result of that, a lot of people, I guess, with chronic illnesses had more health problems, and actually some of them may have passed away. For me, for example, 3 family members who had cancer passed away within the, between March and May of 2020. And some of it may really be due to the fact that their medical care was interfered with. And then finally, once again, from a personal anecdote, I had a cousin who had waited more than 20 years to be eligible for a green card through family reunification. And when at the beginning of the pandemic, she decided to just leave because she was really concerned about her neighbors and co-workers buying guns and ammunition to prepare for the pandemic. And she was thinking, this is crazy. Maybe America is a little bit too dangerous and strange. So those were a lot of the issues that we were dealing with. And of course, the George Floyd killing that really, I think, changed a lot of things for both, I guess, racial and economic discussions, in terms of really thinking about the fact that, for me personally, really reflecting upon the fact that George Floyd was killed over a $20 bill. And so that spurred me to return to the practice of law and really develop as a inclusive economies attorney. All right. So Building Back Better is also a political, also has a political context. And for example, Biden's economic agenda is trying to remedy some of the issues that came up during the pandemic. In addition to the Biden's economic agenda, there has been a lot of advocacy around just transition, especially in the legal field. And so the post-pandemic recovery seems to be somewhat fairly grounded in also aspirations to achieve priority goals with economy, ecology, and equity. So for example, the Biden's agenda for ecology is going to look at climate change, reducing emissions through improving airports, roads, bridges. And it has interesting features, such as including tax rebates for buying electric bikes, or bike commuting, getting rebates as well for bike commuting. For the economy, there's really an emphasis for good paying jobs, especially union jobs, where unions would be able to fight for workers' rights. And then definitely an interest in cooperatives that could be more equitable for workers and provide them with ownership opportunities. In terms of equity, there will be efforts to reconnect the Black communities that were divided by highways, cleanup of industrial sites that are adjacent to Black and Brown communities, and therefore will benefit them by providing more environmental justice and reparation, and then making broadband more accessible to rural and poor communities, improving public transportation so that especially, yes, lower income communities, maybe also Black and brown communities would be better connected to jobs and opportunities, efforts to improve the drinking water, and then also looking at home care. And some of it does come from the fact that, I guess, during the pandemic, so many people had to rely on home care instead of being able to go to hospitals and community clinics. So from a legal perspective, Building Back Better also allowed for going back to community lawyering and movement lawyering. So community lawyering is really about lawyering as social engineering version 2.0. Community lawyering is about thinking about accountability to the community. And then movement lawyering is about being a lawyer who helps build a more just legal system as attorneys are working with communities, and I guess can see changes that need to be made. They can also be involved in educating and facilitating changes in the legal system. I'm a SELC fellow, which is SELC is the Sustainable Economies Law Center. It's based in the Bay Area, and it's often looked at a pioneer in sustainable economies law innovations. And as you can see here, one of the things that they have done that is really unusual is having cartoon bylaws and being able to say that from a language access perspective, it makes complete sense, and it's perfectly, acceptable as bylaws. They have a lot of very innovative projects, such as a radical real estate law school, and because California allows apprenticeship to become attorneys, they also train a lot of community members as new attorneys. The advantages of cooperatives. So cooperatives are sustainable, resilient, and then really emphasize local wealth building. They're sustainable in the sense that they tend to pay a higher wage. They provide training to their workers, members, so that there's an ability to move up. And then in general, they tend to think about the next generation of workers, so that the business should be kept so that the next generation of workers will also have work. Resilient. During the pandemic, there were less terminations. There was more solidarity and long-term outlook, and definitely also less closures during the pandemic. The local emphasis is really that in general, cooperatives tend to be local businesses that employ local workers. In that sense, a lot of the money, the wealth stays local. Cooperatives tend to be community-oriented. For example, during the pandemic, the New York taxi drivers cooperative was helping to drive people to appointments for medical conditions, emergencies, and they were also helping people to get to voting polls. What happens when you have local businesses and local workers is that those businesses really care about the local quality of life, the safety of their operations, and the protection of the environment in which they work and live. So what makes a cooperative? Compared to a conventional business, a cooperative business, I guess, doesn't have as much stratification. It's a lot more flat. It's less centered upon owners and investors who may not have many relations with the actual work or operations of the business. it might also be more focused on either patrons or workers. Patrons are basically people that have a common goal in coming together as a cooperative community. There's a definite separation between the ownership of a capital and the governance of the entity, so that the voting rights are based on being a member and not how much capital you actually have in the entity. What makes a cooperative? It's also more than the legal form. So in terms of legal forms for cooperatives, you could have cooperatives that are actually formed as under cooperative statutes, or they could also be LLCs or C Corp or S Corp or B Corp or nonprofits that are acting and operating as cooperatives following cooperative principles. And then from a tax perspective, it's also, it might be a completely different thing. The legal identity and the tax identity of cooperatives might be different. From an IRS perspective, businesses, corporations, a nonprofit corporation is also a corporation, can fall under 501(c)s, nonprofits, all types of nonprofits. They could also fall under subchapter K, which are really more partnerships. Subchapter C, which are most corporations, including B corporations. And then there's also a subchapter for S corporations. What is also important to remember about legal forms is that there are really two types of legal issues that cooperatives should focus on. One thing is that definitely there's a legal framework, which is more of a public law mandate that they have to follow. But the legal framework usually is fairly flexible. I mean, they only provide a couple of requirements. The real work for legal, I guess, for legally binding rules for cooperatives, especially, are all about their internal agreements, their bylaws, if they are corporations, as well as nonprofits, or operating agreements if they are LLCs. And even within those, there are many other types of agreements, such as membership agreements, as well as agreements as to how, I guess, monies would be divided. So in terms of the work that attorneys and cooperatives would be doing, it's both to comply with the legal framework from an outside perspective, but really also set up internally what kind of, I guess, internal contracts with each other and with the cooperative they would like to have. So in terms of what makes a cooperative, it's really about operating following cooperative principles. And there are 7 cooperative principles that come from the International Cooperative Association. The first one is open and voluntary membership, which is pretty straightforward. But as you know, some people said, it doesn't mean that you should, if, for example, for your own business purposes, you cannot accept more members, that would be acceptable. Democratic member control means that members have control over the governance of a cooperative. Members' economic participation includes having capital control, meaning that the main capital decisions should be made by members and not investors that may not have as much stake in the cooperative. Autonomy and independence. The assumption is that in a cooperative ecosystem, there would be many independent and autonomous cooperatives. And with that large number, they would be able to support each other. So technically, there shouldn't really be monopolies within cooperative systems. There's a big emphasis on education, training, and information, because in order to be able to manage, operate, and maintain the business, the workers and the members have to be knowledgeable about all of those issues. And then cooperation among cooperatives that support among other cooperatives. And finally, the concern for community, the fact that cooperatives do belong to communities and have certain obligations. Yeah. So, key elements of cooperatives. There are different types of cooperatives. Two of the key elements really in cooperative ownership, it's that there's going to be one member, one vote. And once again, it's not based on how much capital or equity any member has. There's profit sharing and patronage. That's a second element, which is really about how members have an obligation to use the cooperative. And actually, the cooperative's real purpose and mission is really to serve its members. So there are many different types of cooperatives: consumer, producer, purchasing, marketing, worker, and housing cooperatives in general. To be a patron means different things for all those types of cooperatives. Patronage, the way that they use the cooperative is also a little bit different depending on what kind of cooperative they're in. And then the way that they get a patronage refund, which is really a reward on how well they're using and supporting the cooperative, is also different. So for example, for a consumer cooperative, consumers want goods that the cooperative sells. The patronage really depends on how much they're buying from the cooperative. And then the patronage refund may come into the form of a store credit. And that's kind of a model that you have with something like REI, for example. For a worker cooperative, to be a patron is to be somebody who wants to work and works for the cooperative. The patronage is based on the value of the work contributed. It doesn't have to be just hours. The value of the work contributed can be calculated in other ways. And the patronage refund then comes as cash or equity. And then for housing cooperative, members actually own shares of a cooperative-owned building, and that share then entitles them to a unit of living space. So it's a bit of a different model there. So cooperatives are an integral part of the US economy. Cooperatives historically have saved and supported several US economic sectors, such as definitely farming and agriculture. At the beginning of the 20th century in textile and manufacturing. To these days, rural electricity access is provided through many cooperatives. Food cooperatives also allow access to food in many areas that may not always be served by conventional businesses. And there's a long history of Black farming cooperatives that have also helped with specific communities, and so on. The current US worker cooperative movement, to kind of focus on that, and actually it's not only worker cooperative, it's a cooperative movement. I guess I added worker by mistake. But definitely you have a lot of US government involvement, especially from the USDA and the IRS. There's a pretty good cooperative finance sector with many credit unions and CDFIs that are not just serving cooperatives, but economic development in general. And then there are many national organizations for cooperatives. So the US Federation Cooperatives Association, the NCB, which is the National Cooperative Business Association, NCG, which is the National Cooperative of Grocery Cooperatives, and then the NCFC, which is more about farming, the NAHC, which is about housing cooperatives, and the NRECA, which is about rural electric cooperatives. There are many TA professionals within the cooperative movement, definitely cooperative developers, but also attorneys and accountants and other types of professionals that are specialized in helping cooperatives. In terms of current issues that the cooperative movement is concerned about, I checked with somebody who does advocacy, and they said one of the big issue is trying to get $100 million for the SBA so that they could provide S7A loans that would not need personal guarantees for co-ops. DC also has a long cooperative history. So back in from 1921 actually to 1972, there were a large number of district grocery stores, up to 300 at peak time, and many of them were for Jewish migrants from Europe. I even found one Asian store that was part of that group. And basically they were a one-room grocery store with a family living upstairs so that they could work at any time at the grocery store. In the 1930s, you had Capital Cab Company that was the nation's largest cab cooperative. In 1970, you had the first food cooperative in public housing, the MLK Cooperative Store number 2 at the Arthur Capper Public Housing Project. In the 1980s, Mayor Berry's had a huge DC cooperative agenda. Nowadays, the current DC worker cooperative TA system overview. So DAWI, which is a branch of the US Federation of Worker Cooperatives, goes around and trains city officials to be better able to assist with the development and support of cooperatives. So they trained 3 staff members in DC. You also have oftentimes cooperatives included in RFPs. However, there is no dedicated funding for just cooperatives. You have a couple of CDFIs, such as WACIF, the Washington area, and then the CIF. Yeah, it's a financing institution. What they have at the moment this year was $40,000 for startups, and they divided that into 4 grants for 4 startup cooperatives. And of course, there were like tons of applications, but only 4 could be funded. Their main focus is really conversions for businesses that have at least 5 years of history. And they just started an ownership center that mostly focuses on conversions. Capital Impact is another CDFI that works a lot in the DC area. Right now, they have a food co-ops and other types of food entities project through a grant from DC. There are many TA professionals. There are a couple of training organizations, one that is based both in Baltimore and DC, and then in Southeast, and then one that does DMV work. There are some co-op developers and some consultants, organizations and consultants. They are co-op attorneys, mostly in private practice or at law clinics. It's not clear if they are actual co-op accountants, and definitely there are community land trusts that are existing here. There is an informal group called the DC Co-op Stakeholders Group that tries to serve as a network for cooperatives. Currently in DC, there are several cooperatives in operation or in the planning. Definitely many housing co-ops. There are many pre-K kids co-ops that are basically parents coming together to like hire a teacher and decide on curriculum together. There are miscellaneous cooperatives or collectives in the planning, such as a community grocery co-op in Southeast, the CareWorks Community Home Care Co-op somewhere in Southeast as well, the DC Language Co-op, which is going to be a language access cooperative. There are more informal collectives, such as a collective for street vendors, something called the Brighter Days Collective, which is a flavorful Black food collective, the DC Pop-Up Collective, which is really different small businesses that come together to share space. The Starseed Earthroot, which is an LGBTQ farm collective, and then several arts collective. And then in terms of worker cooperatives, you have Dolce Hogar, which is a cleaning collective, Frontlets Tech, which provides tech services, Crowdwork DC LCA, which is back office support, but also training. I'm actually a worker member of Crowdwork. The Deanwood Co-op, which is coming up, which is going to be a food co-op. And then there was supposed to be a cafe, and it's not really sure exactly what the status is. Interestingly enough, most of the TA organizations that operate in DC are not, they are not formed as, they don't operate as cooperatives. All right. So here there's some of the DC's challenges and gaps for co-ops. So financing is definitely a challenge. There's a lack of startup grants, also research and development grants to establish different types of co-ops and have them try different models. There are some zero or low interest loans, but not enough. There's definitely no dedicated cooperative fund. There is also no legislation that is exempting cooperative community investors from the SEC, for example. Investment incentives, also tax breaks or deductions are not there. DC has a huge challenge with high cost. So the land or rentals are very expensive. Insurance is also pretty expensive. The cost of living is expensive. So we have a couple of community land trusts, and more work will need to be done with them to really see how they will support cooperatives. Some areas, like the Bay Area, have real estate holding companies that are actually holding the real estate. And we're definitely lacking that in DC. Having co-op insurance, it's actually not really existing anywhere in the country, but insurance is pretty expensive for commercial entities. Having more opportunities for procurement that would provide stable income for cooperatives. And then having more co-ops, of course, so that there could be more co-op to co-op, business to business transactions that could offer solidarity rates. In terms of the ecosystem, we have a couple of co-op incubators, but we're still kind of missing them as well. So to form cooperatives in DC, there are basically two statutes. And one of them is the DC General Cooperative Statute of 2020. It does require that you use the name Cooperative Association somewhere. It could be abbreviated, but it has to be there. It's treated as a nonprofit for tax and securities law. And it also provides an explanation for what it means to operate on a cooperative basis. It does mean that you have to have one member, one vote, that you have to have a return on share or membership capital that is less than 8%. And there should be a net profits distribution for patronage that should be used for co-op expansion or reducing cost for members. To form as a general cooperative association, you need at least 5 individuals or 2 or more associations. The cooperative operates for the benefit of patrons that are united for a common purpose. And then the powers of a corporation, I mean, cooperatives have the powers of corporation for property ownership and financing. And finally, there is a measure to hold cooperatives exempt or immune from trade restraints and antitrust. The bylaws require that there should be a provision for members' admission and their term, as well as how to dispose of members' interest when the members leave the cooperative. There are some provisions for meeting logistics, which are very important when you have a lot of members that are supposed to be involved in governance and capital decisions. And there's also a requirement that there should be a method for distributing net savings, which is really the patronage. The other statute for cooperatives in DC is the Uniform Limited Cooperative Association Act of 2010. Here again, there is a requirement that the business should have limited cooperative association in the name, even if it's abbreviated. You need at least one organizer, and there, I guess, there's a recognition that you might be able to have somebody organize the LCA who is not a member, but they're just organizing before. There's a requirement that there should be at least 2 patron members, unless it's a cooperative that is starting the LCA for its own business purposes. In that case, you would only need 1 co-op member. What is very different about LCAs, which are not available in all states, is that LCAs allow for investor members. And so usually cooperatives try to not, I guess, emphasize investments from, or maybe they may even prohibit investments from outsiders. But LCAs actually allow for outside investors to become involved. LCAs were mostly created for capital-intensive co-ops, such as processing co-ops that would need to process, they would need land, buildings, heavy equipment to process food, for example. With LCAs, you definitely have distributions, you have voting rights and powers. You also have exemption or immunity from trade restraints and antitrust, because members might be working together, or they might have special solidarity deals with different members or partners. A member from the LCA can lend to and do business with the LCA. There is a right to information, and that is all about the way that members are supposed to be, of course, involved in the governance and the capital decisions. And the LCA has also an interesting clause against around marketing contracts. The fact that the cooperative may be producing right. Okay. And now, yeah. Now okay. At any rate, the cooperative may be producing goods, and then they have contracts to sell and market those products. And so the LCA allows profits to be distributed to those non-members. as well as actually profits and losses as well. And so the bylaws for the LCA really only require that you should have a clear capital structure, say what kind of member classes, what kind of interest they might have, what is their right to share profits. The bylaws should also say how members are admitted, and then what are the voting interests of members, different classes, over governance interest, whether financial rights can be transferred or not, how to allocate profits and losses, the non-members' allocation of profits and losses, the numbers and terms of directors, and then the fact that, of course, it's possible to amend the bylaw before the admission of members. So you could have bylaws that were created before you had members, but after you have members, you can amend that. All right. But once again, technically, you could have any type of, other types of legal structures. You could be a nonprofit, you could be an LLC, you could be an S Corp, you could be an informal collective, a housing cooperative, and not fall under those two cooperative statutes, but act and operate as a cooperative. And you would be eligible for some of the cooperative benefits, which are mostly tax benefits that we're not talking about today. So worker cooperatives really, a worker cooperative means that you have a worker owner class of members. And a worker member is basically somebody who works for the cooperative, but they also own the cooperative. There's going to be majority control of the governance and the capital by the worker owner class. Patronage is based on the work that is contributed to the worker cooperative, either in hours or in overvalue. Overvalue could be like helping to create more jobs, which is not quite working hours. Worker owners have substantial equity. They have the ability to build wealth and to share wealth. And because of that, there needs to be special mechanism to redistribute the equity when they leave, because they cannot just, take the significant amount of equity that they have with them just upon departure. So this shows that employee stock ownership plans are not worker cooperatives. And there are, for example, 4 different features. So for ownership, for example, with Asops, it's really a trust that owns the shares and later allocate them to workers. With worker co-ops, workers own their own shares. In terms of being able to select decision makers that are going to be, I guess, making decisions regarding the shares, then the company of the trust are really making those types of decisions. In worker co-ops, you have workers that are making those types of decisions. The governance, there is no mandate actually that there should be democratic governance with Asops, but with worker co-ops, you have a mandate that there has to be democratic governance within worker cooperatives. And then finally, the distributions. In Asops, you tend to have distributions of your shares, of the value of your shares at separation if you leave, or at retirement, which is also another way of living. For worker co-ops, you get distributions when you're working according to a specific schedule, but usually it's when you are working there. So one way that Asops can be a little bit closer to worker co-ops is by adding workforce education and then also more participatory processes. Also, if an Asop gets to 100% worker ownership, then I guess, yes, they would definitely be a lot closer to, and the equivalent of a worker co-op. So for Asops, there are all types of Asops, but one site that I found, I guess, had this kind of clear clear explanations of 3 different types of Asops. So you could have a non-leveraged Asop, which is basically that there would be no outside borrowing. The company would create new shares to distribute to their workers, and of course, taking that action would promote growth because they would get tax deductions from new shares. And so basically you have a company using its own money, putting the shares, setting up a trust, and then the trust is going to be managing the shares and later allocate to the workers directly. A second type is a leveraged buyout Asop. So there you buy, typically you would buy shares from retiring shareholders. And so those types of Asops would be used for succession. And there you would have tax deferred gains and tax favored financing. So definitely always tax decisions to be made and tax advantages that would provide incentives to go that route. There you would have borrowing from an outside lender, and then also definitely more involvement because you would be buying from retiring shareholders. And then the last type of Asop is more of a new issuance Asop, meaning that there's really a borrowing from an outside lender to issue new shares. The shares are only allocated to workers as the loan is repaid. And there the tax advantages would be that you would get tax advantage financing that you could use for purchasing goods, because the principal that is borrowed is tax deductible as repaid by contribution, as they are repaid by contributions. So that ends our, I guess, the presentation, like 3 minutes late, but it still gives like 12 minutes to answer questions, to ask what could be next, and other issues. What I was kind of hoping by offering this presentation is that there could really be interest and mobilizing to learn more about cooperatives, but also action to create, develop, and support more cooperatives in the DC area. So I'm definitely interested in people contacting me later, definitely, but also, of course, working with the DC Pro Bono Center and maybe possibly offering more sessions, more webinars that could address those issues.
Fantastic. Thank you. Okay, so the first question, you had mentioned under DC law, the 2 statutory regimes for co-ops require a certain number of owners to start out. But is there a requirement that an LLC or a corporation that structures itself as a co-op has to have, for example, can they start with 1 owner and bring on more later?
Yes. If you are registering your business as under another statute, then you would have to meet the requirements of that statute. And the way that you would be considered a cooperative is because you would operate as a cooperative, and then later on, I guess it's important if you want to take advantage of some of the tax benefits, so you could always go later. For example, an LLC can file taxes as a subchapter C entity, which then would make it eligible for subchapter T benefits, which is really all the deferred tax payments for contributions that are made to workers or members' internal accounts. Yeah.
Okay, great. Is it possible for existing businesses structured as an LLC or a corporation to convert their current traditional ownership structure to a cooperative model?
Yes, yes.
Okay. And would you say that for a business considering that, is it easier to convert their existing ownership structure, or would it make more sense to start an entirely new entity to do that?
Right. So the question there really is, so right now there's a lot of interest and a lot of resources for conversions, because I think that a lot of people within the cooperative movement and outside the cooperative movement feel that it's one of the easiest and quickest way to get more employee ownership and employee benefit sharing. What happens there is that if you have an existing business, you already have a history of, income generation, credit history, and all of those things. And so therefore, you might, there's probably funding that is, available for conversions. There might be loans that are available for conversions that would be easier to access and distribute because of all those factors, having that history. Whereas starting from scratch, it would be the same challenge as with startup co-ops, which is that you would basically, as a new business, you would not have the same history. And I think if you were converting by starting new, then because you would be in a new business model, then you couldn't argue right away that you already have a history of, operating as a co-op, right? And so you would be in the same situation as a startup co-op, which is that people have really no idea if you're going to be successful and if you're going to be operating in a profitable manner. And so it might be more difficult to, I think, have a certain access to financing. However, yeah, I think for conversions, really, the main thing is it's a little bit like other types of legal entities, which is that it would be up to both the previous business owners, but also the new worker owners, to really make a commitment to say that we want to be a very equitable and democratic company that operates as a worker cooperative with the governance and the profit sharing that worker cooperatives have. And so it might take some work, but from a financial perspective, I think it would be easier. From a procedural and operational perspective, it will still be challenging because you would have to let go of old operational practices and structures. But I think it's doable. Yeah, I hope that explain that. I hope that that answers the question.
I think so, and it has some practical tidbits in there, which is always important. On that, thinking somewhat in the terms of actually taking this information and understanding co-ops and putting it into action, are there any pitfalls or unexpected obstacles that a hopeful worker cooperative should be aware of as they're planning to go ahead with the process?
Yes. So the two biggest challenges really for worker cooperatives are definitely financial access. So having financial institutions that understand how worker cooperatives operate. And then the second challenge, I think, which is about, as worrisome as the financial issues, is really around the governance. The fact that it is difficult to to govern oneself in a democratic way. And so within the worker cooperative world, there's a lot of interest and actually effort made into finding appropriate governance models, systems, and all of those things. Right now, people are very interested in sociocracy, which is a specific way of having circles of decision making that break down issues in different spheres and giving autonomous controls to those different spheres. And then they come together with some type of top circle where all the issues can be discussed together, but it both it allows for a distribution of a decision making, more efficiency in terms of not having everyone, discuss everything and be in so many meetings. Yeah, and also it helps to create more consensus building. Being able to come to consensus and to make really difficult decisions together. Because what happens with the worker cooperatives is that you have to, for example, decide what is a fair compensation, right, for the workers, how much equity to require from members, how much collective monies to collect from each members, and sometimes they can be difficult decisions.
Okay. Something that is of interest is wondering, do you believe that there is some type of a hybrid business model that falls between a cooperative and a traditional model? So specifically here, asking, are there ways to incorporate cooperative principles without being an entirely cooperative business? And if so, are there some principles that are more important to incorporate than others?
Yes, and definitely, I mean, you have many companies right now that are officially structured and registered as other types of business entities, but they are trying to operate as cooperatives. And yeah, so the answer for that is yes. The most important cooperative principles are really ideally, of course, all the 7 principles should be applied because they support each other. But I would say, and once again, it's my opinion as someone who's been, I guess, involved in a worker cooperative and with cooperatives for a little bit, is that definitely the democratic control and the democratic the democratic decision making around governance and the democratic decision making around the capital, the finances, are the 2 most critical features. But other than that, unless you have education of of your members, then it would be really, really difficult to have them be able to manage both the operations and the finances of the cooperative. So if it were a worker cooperative, but I think even for non-worker cooperatives, member cooperatives that are not like actually working there and really deciding on the management and the finances of the cooperative, you would still need to have a certain level of education and training so that you really understand how to keep your cooperative sustainable for the long term, which has been, I think it's been a challenge of being able to have sustainable cooperatives in DC. yeah, I think these cooperative challenges have really been two things. Is that it's been so expensive to operate here that if the cooperatives are successful, they move out of DC so that it's more affordable, or really they just have challenges that they cannot overcome, and then they're not sustaining in the long term. So yeah.
Okay. Well, it looks like we are at the end of our hour. And I want to thank you, Pacyinz, and thank you to all of our listeners for joining. Once this webinar ends, we'll direct you to a participant survey for all of the attendees. So please share your thoughts on this webinar there, as well as topics that you're interested in future webinars on, and anything related particularly to this worker cooperative topic. Do you want to dive more into this? What more about it do you want to learn for your current or future business? In addition, remember that if you would like to speak one-on-one with an attorney for free about your small business or organization, view the DC Bar Pro Bono Center's upcoming events, and access our online resource library, you can visit online at lawhelp.org/DC/NPSB. lawhelp.org/DC/NPSB. And with that, thank you again, Pacyinz, for this incredibly informative and interesting webinar.
Thank you everyone for attending, and I would welcome people reaching out, either my email or send me a text or call me. I'm very interested in meeting other people who are who want to promote and develop and support cooperatives in the DC area.
Fantastic. Thank you again, and I hope that everybody has a wonderful afternoon.